Sophie appeared on the street, barefoot, walking her dog. But when the millionaire approached and took a closer look, she felt a chill run down her spine. But before we dive into the full story, let me know where you're watching from and what time it is. Now, subscribe to the channel and let's get started. Sophie jolted awake to the low, raspy whine coming from the foot of her bed. Her heart skipped, and she flicked on the lamp to see Buddy, her golden retriever, sprawled on the worn rug. His breathing sounded shallow, like he was struggling to fill his lungs. Quickly, she slid out from under her thin blanket and knelt beside him, gently running a hand over his soft ears. He gave a weak thump of the tail, enough to show he recognized her presence, but that subtle wag only made her worry more. The glow of the bedside lamp revealed the cramped studio apartment around them. Boxes of unpacked items and second-hand furniture cluttered the corners, attesting to how Sophie had recently downsized to afford rent. It was no secret she had almost nothing left in her bank account after covering the basics. And now Buddy, her only family in the city, was sick. She could feel the dread coiling in her chest, threatening to choke her. Vet bills were always steep. She had heard stories, dreaded them, prayed never to face them. Yet here she was. Without a moment's hesitation, Sophie reached for her phone and began calling clinics. The first one answered, sounded groggy, and told her they didn't accept after-hours emergencies without a deposit. She tried another. Same story. Different words, but the same final answer. Most wouldn't even pick up at all. Finally, one place offered a basic exam if she showed up at once, which was better than nothing. She hung up and gently lifted Buddy's head. "I'm so sorry," she whispered, pressing her forehead against his muzzle. "I'll find a way to get you help. Just hang in there, okay?" The world outside was cloaked in a damp darkness. The street lamps glowed faintly against the night sky, and the wind carried a slight chill that cut through Sophie's thin sweater. She coaxed Buddy along, letting him walk at his own strained pace. It hurt to watch him hobble slowly, but she didn't want to scare him by picking him up. He was a big dog, and any jostle could make him feel worse. They passed the dimly lit windows of closed shops, their reflections flickering on puddles from a recent drizzle. A random car rushed by, splashing water onto the curb. At this hour, the city felt empty, as if no one else existed beyond Sophie and her ailing companion. When they finally reached the old clinic, a flickering neon sign revealed peeling paint around the entrance. Inside, the waiting area was small, with an outdated poster about flea treatments on the wall. A harried receptionist gave them a quick once-over, raising an eyebrow at Sophie's obvious lack of resources. Her uniform looked rumpled and she seemed moments from clocking out. "You understand we need payment up front," the receptionist said without looking up from her paperwork. "I can't let you see the vet otherwise." Sophie tightened her grip on Buddy's leash, feeling panic twist inside her. I can't pay right now, but maybe there's a payment plan?" She tried her best to keep her voice steady. "He's really sick." The receptionist sighed, already exasperated. "We can do a quick exam, just a basic once-over." She looked at Sophie from behind tired eyes. "If it's serious, we can't do more until we get at least half up front." The exam lasted 5 minutes. The vet on duty, half asleep, took a glance at Buddy's mouth and listened to his heartbeat. Afterwards, he simply stated that Buddy would need further tests, but that they couldn't proceed for free. Sophie's chest tightened in silent fury. Buddy looked so weak, panting on the cold tile floor. She gathered him in her arms, apologized quietly, and left. The knot of despair in her stomach grew heavier. She felt like she had let her dog down, and that guilt was almost too much to bear. Outside, the air was still. It was nearly 2 a.m. The city was hushed, except for the occasional distant rumble of a late-night bus. Sophie eased Buddy onto a nearby bench. She pulled out her phone to see if Brianna, her closest friend, was still awake. Miraculously, Brianna picked up, and when Sophie explained the situation, her friend promised to come as soon as possible. While she waited, a tall figure approached, wearing a weathered jacket and reeking of cigarette smoke. His voice drawled with a familiarity that put her on edge. Sophie recognized him as the debt collector who had been hounding her for weeks, though she didn't know his name, only the threats he had repeated about late payments. "You still owe, girl," he said, hands shoved deep in his pockets. His gaze flicked to the dog. "Running out of time to pay up, or else." Sophie's fingers clenched around Buddy's leash. "Now's not the time," she muttered, looking down, refusing to meet his eyes. He barked a bitter laugh. "There won't be a later if you keep ignoring your debts." His eyes traveled over Buddy's limp form. "Should have thought of that before you took on more responsibilities than you can handle." She said nothing, just held Buddy's head closer, bracing for him to say something worse. A car turning the corner momentarily caught the man's attention, and Sophie took the chance to focus on Buddy instead. Her voice barely above a whisper, she promised him she'd figure it out, that they'd find some help, that this wasn't the end. Moments later, Brianna's small hatchback screeched to a halt near the bench, headlights glaring through the darkness. The debt collector disappeared into the shadows, and Brianna jumped out. Her usually cheerful face looked tense, worried. "Are you okay?" she asked, gently placing a hand on Sophie's arm. She glanced down at Buddy. "He doesn't look too good." "He needs proper care," Sophie said. "Every place I called wants money I don't have." Brianna's eyes glistened with concern. "Let's figure something out," she insisted, helping Sophie guide Buddy into the passenger seat. "I'll look up more clinics, see if there's an emergency vet who might work with us on the payment." They drove for a while, but each clinic either had closed doors or demanded fees Sophie simply couldn't pay up front. The rejections came swiftly, one after another, adding more weight to the dread suffocating her. By the time they reached the last place on their list, Buddy was trembling, and Sophie's heart felt close to breaking. The clinic was shut tight. Not a light flickered inside. "It's no use," Sophie murmured in defeat. She cradled Buddy's head in her lap, stroking his golden fur. His eyes were only half open, but he held her gaze with a gentle trust. "I'm so sorry, boy," she whispered, tears threatening to spill. Brianna pulled over beside a quiet stretch of sidewalk beneath looming trees. The overhead lamps cast long shadows across the pavement. "What can we do now?" "I don't know." Sophie's voice cracked. She got out of the car and coaxed Buddy to follow. He took a wobbly step, then sank onto the cool grass. She knelt beside him, feeling helpless. Brianna's phone started buzzing with messages about job leads or small loans, but none sounded promising. Sophie stared at the sky as if hoping for a miracle. The distant hum of traffic echoed through the empty street, and time itself seemed frozen in the silent darkness. It was just then that Buddy's breathing grew more labored. He let out a low whimper, and Sophie's heart squeezed in panic. She sank to the sidewalk, holding him close, ignoring the dirt that clung to her jeans. Her tears blurred her vision, but she refused to let go of Buddy's paw. At that moment, she would have given anything, done anything, to save him. She remained like that for minutes, or maybe hours, time lost to the waves of fear that washed over her. Brianna hovered close by, dialing random numbers for help, but no one answered. The street stretched out, empty in every direction, while the occasional glow of headlights slid across the buildings. Finally, headlights drew closer and slowed. A sleek car she didn't recognize stopped, bathing Sophie and Buddy in a bright white glow. She shielded her eyes for a moment and then saw a figure step out. Tall, well-dressed, his hair catching the light just enough to reveal concern in his expression. He approached slowly, shoes clicking on the asphalt until he reached them. "Is your dog hurt?" he asked, voice calm yet urgent. Sophie could only nod, tears rolling down her cheeks. Without any hesitation, the man dropped to one knee and laid a gentle hand on Buddy's chest. He seemed to know exactly what he was doing, pressing his fingers lightly to check Buddy's pulse. Then, in one decisive moment, the stranger turned to Sophie. "I can help," he said. She blinked away tears, thinking her weary mind might be playing tricks. But no, he was definitely there, looking right at her. Relief and disbelief flooded her in equal measure. As Sophie cuddles Buddy on the sidewalk, headlights wash over them. The silhouette of a man steps out of a car, kneels beside Buddy and says in a calm voice, "I can help." Sophie looks up in disbelief. Sophie blinked through the headlights, her arms still wrapped protectively around Buddy. The stranger knelt beside them, a look of clear concern on his face. She caught a hint of professional confidence in his expression. Something about the way he was assessing Buddy told her this man understood animals in a way most people didn't. She could barely find her voice. "Please," she managed, her throat tight. "If there's anything you can do—" The man introduced himself as Dr. Maxwell Carter, but Sophie barely caught his name over her own frantic heartbeat. He quickly pressed 2 fingers against Buddy's neck, checking the dog's pulse, then placed a hand gently on his rib cage to gauge the ragged breathing. In a tone that allowed no argument, Max asked Sophie to help lift Buddy into his car. The vehicle's interior light revealed plush seats and a faint smell of leather, a world away from Sophie's battered old hatchback. Once they were inside, Sophie perched in the back seat with Buddy resting his chin on her lap. She could feel the poor dog trembling. Max eased the car into gear and navigated the quiet streets. At first, Sophie's mind raced with questions. Who was he, really? What if he wasn't who he claimed to be? But then, she glanced at Buddy, who was too weak even to lift his head, and a rush of gratitude coursed through her. She had no choice but to trust this stranger. They pulled up to a modern veterinary clinic that seemed surprisingly well lit for the middle of the night. The building was all glass windows and clean white walls, a stark contrast to the rundown clinic Sophie had just visited. Max stepped out, tapped a security code at the door, and hurried to open the passenger side so Sophie could carry Buddy in. Inside, fluorescent lights hummed and reflected against a spotless floor. Reception desks with sleek countertops lined the front area, and behind them, a hallway led toward exam rooms filled with state-of-the-art equipment. A young technician with disheveled hair approached, looking startled to see them. Max briskly explained Buddy's condition, rattling off vital signs. The technician's surprise flickered over her face again when she glanced at Sophie's worn-out clothes and Buddy's battered leash. Sophie could sense the unspoken question. How did these two end up here, in such an upscale place? Without a pause, Max guided them to an exam room. He grabbed a stethoscope, checking Buddy's heart more thoroughly. Sophie hovered at the edge, her hands clasped together to stop them from shaking. She watched as Max set up an IV line, motioning for the technician to bring fluids and medication. "Sophie," he said in a low, calm tone, "Buddy's vitals are weak, but it looks like we can stabilize him. I'm going to run some quick tests. Do you trust me?" She nodded, swallowing the lump in her throat. "Yes," she whispered, tears of relief sliding down her cheeks. Before long, Max had drawn blood, started Buddy on oxygen, and given him something for the pain. The man moved with surety, comfortable in his domain, and yet he never forgot to look up and give Sophie a reassuring nod every few minutes. As they waited for the blood work, Sophie stood awkwardly against the wall, arms crossed against the chill of the air conditioning. Buddy lay on a padded table receiving fluids. She couldn't ignore the hush that fell over the clinic staff, who eyed her with a mix of curiosity and disapproval. She heard muffled whispers in the corridor, words like charity case and not standard procedure. Her cheeks burned with embarrassment. She had no money to speak of and no way to repay whatever these test results and overnight stay would cost. Why on earth was Max Carter helping her? A door opened, and Brianna, breathless from worry, hurried in. Sophie realized she'd managed to shoot her friend a quick text with the address. Brianna stared in awe at the pristine exam room, then rushed to Sophie's side. "You okay?" she whispered. Sophie nodded as best she could, though her eyes flicked anxiously toward Buddy. "He's in good hands," she said, glancing at Max, who offered a small, encouraging smile in return. After the initial tests, Max stepped away to consult with a second veterinarian on staff, an older woman who looked distinctly displeased. Sophie could only catch fragments of their hushed conversation, but it sounded like they were arguing over the clinic's policy. Eventually, Max returned, jaw set as if he'd just won a small battle. "Buddy can stay the night," he said softly, fixing Sophie with a kind look. "We'll monitor him closely, run some more tests, and see how he improves." Her relief was immediate and profound, and the tears she'd been holding in spilled over. "Thank you," she murmured. I don't know how I can ever—" He lifted a hand gently to interrupt. "Don't worry about that now. Let's just make sure Buddy recovers." A nurse appeared with a clipboard, awkwardly asking Sophie for her information. Sophie filled out the form with trembling fingers, feeling Brianna's supportive hand on her back. As soon as the nurse was gone, Max raised an eyebrow at the mention of finances, but he didn't comment. Instead, he turned to check the IV drip, adjusting it carefully. Within the hour, Buddy's breathing steadied. His eyes opened, a soft glow of recognition shining as he scanned the faces around him. Sophie perched next to him, lightly stroking the top of his head. When she glanced at Max, she noticed how he studied the dog's reaction, relief evident in his features. He didn't look like a stranger anymore. There was a warmth in his eyes that made her trust him without question. While Buddy rested, Max ducked into the hallway, quickly retrieving a ringing phone from his pocket. Sophie assumed it was a personal call until she heard him mention father in a frustrated tone. She glanced at Brianna, who gave her a worried shrug. Soon after, Max returned, forcing a calm smile onto his face. He said nothing about the conversation. Brianna stayed for a while, helping keep Sophie's spirits up, but eventually had to leave for her shift in the morning. She hugged Sophie tight and patted Buddy on the head before promising to check in again soon. That left Sophie alone in the exam room, the hum of the overhead lights filling the silence. Max approached her. "We should set up somewhere for you to rest. It's been a long night." "I'm fine," Sophie insisted, glancing at Buddy. "I'd like to stay right here if that's okay. I can't leave him." He nodded. "I understand. Just know we'll take good care of him." She watched as he scribbled some notes on a chart. She wondered how someone so obviously well off had ended up in this quiet, empty clinic at precisely the moment she needed help the most. Instinct told her she should be wary, but her heart was filled with gratitude. Buddy was finally receiving the care he needed, and that was all that mattered in this moment. Hours passed in a blur of soft beeps and low voices. Buddy drifted in and out of a doze, each breath a little easier than the last. Sophie couldn't bring herself to lie down or even look away for too long. The clinic felt foreign to her. Everyone else wore scrubs, carried medical tools, or tapped on tablets. She was the one who didn't belong. Late into the night, as Sophie was lightly dozing with her head on the edge of Buddy's table, Max came to her side. "The test results are coming in tomorrow," he said quietly. "We'll know more then, but right now, Buddy's stable." She lifted her head and gave a tired but grateful smile. "Thank you," she repeated. It was all she could think to say. The words felt small compared to what he was doing for her. Max's phone buzzed again. This time he stepped out of the room before answering. Sophie overheard muted snippets. "Yes, I know. It's late. No, I'm not going to. Because I can't refuse her, that's why." Then the door closed softly behind him. Curiosity needled at Sophie, but she tried not to let it consume her. She focused instead on the gentle rise and fall of Buddy's chest, feeling a glimmer of hope for the first time in hours. Maybe, just maybe, they had turned a corner. Yet she couldn't shake the sense of unease that lingered in the back of her mind. Max was obviously dealing with people who questioned his choices. Who were they? And what did that mean for Buddy? When Max returned, he had a polite smile ready, though it didn't entirely hide his tension. He checked Buddy one more time, carefully adjusting the IV. As he did, Sophie couldn't help noticing how gentle his hands were, despite the clear exhaustion etched on his face. Whatever else might be happening behind the scenes, Max was dedicated to saving her dog, and that was something she wouldn't forget. Then, just as she began to form the words to thank him again, Max's phone rang once more, the shrill tones slicing through the stillness of the night. He glanced at the screen, and his expression shifted into something darker. Without explaining, he stepped into the hall. Sophie strained to catch what he was saying, but only managed to hear him speak in a low voice that trembled slightly with frustration or concern. She couldn't help inching closer to the door, hoping to piece together the conversation. Then, in a hushed tone, he said, "I know this is unusual, but I won't turn her away." Sophie's heart thudded hard. Turn who away? The answer was obvious. He had to be talking about her. Suddenly, a knot of worry formed in her chest. Would this mysterious caller push Max to send her and Buddy packing? The idea made her stomach twist. She took a slow breath, reminding herself that Buddy was stable for the moment. But the tension she sensed in Max's voice suggested he was facing a battle, and battles could mean casualties. Her pulse spiked as she heard him hang up the phone. She scurried back to Buddy's side, trying to act nonchalant, but the conversation stayed in her mind, looping with every uncertain thought. Max's phone rings again. He sees the caller ID, someone from the clinic board. With a troubled look, he turns away from Sophie to answer. She overhears him saying, "I know this is unusual, but I won't turn her away." Her heart pounds, uncertain about what that means for Buddy and for her. Max clicked his phone off, tension lingering in his gaze. He stood in the clinic hallway for a moment, shoulders stiff, exhaling slowly before stepping back into the exam room where Sophie sat. She was leaning over Buddy's kennel, gently resting her cheek against the bars to comfort him. Her eyes darted up at the sight of Max, brimming with curiosity and concern, but she stayed silent. Something in his posture told her he didn't want to talk about the call. She watched him approach the kennel, his face shifting from tense to resolutely calm. Buddy stirred inside, letting out a soft sound that was half whine, half greeting. Max knelt beside the kennel door, reaching in to carefully check Buddy's temperature. His voice, when he spoke, was deliberately casual. "How are you holding up?" he asked Sophie. She managed a wavering smile. "I'm okay, just tired. I think I nodded off for a few minutes." Max nodded. "He's stable for now, but there's still a lot of work to do. Try to get some rest if you can." Sophie glanced around. The clinic was awake, but not necessarily bustling. A couple of staff members milled about, organizing supplies or checking equipment, but they acted as if she were invisible. She noticed the sidelong looks and hushed murmurs. It made her uneasy. She sensed she wasn't welcome. Not really. Still, she couldn't bear to leave Buddy's side. A few hours later, as morning light filtered through the frosted windows, a young vet technician came by, handing Max a folder thick with lab results. He scanned the documents, his brow creasing. Standing by Buddy's kennel, Sophie hovered like a worried parent, waiting to hear any snippets. When Max finished, he took a slow breath and walked over to Sophie. His expression was resolute but soft around the edges. "His condition is critical but manageable if we move quickly," he said. "These results confirm he's got a severe infection we need to tackle aggressively. Antibiotics, fluids, proper monitoring. He's going to need more specialized care, possibly surgery, but for now we'll focus on stabilizing him." Sophie nodded, relief flickering in her eyes at the possibility of saving her dog. Yet guilt snuck in too. The cost of those treatments would be astronomical, and she had nothing to offer in return. Keeping her voice low, she said, I don't know how I'll ever repay you or this clinic." Max shook his head. "Let's worry about Buddy first." But his words did nothing to chase away the tension etched across his features. Sophie sensed the unspoken battle raging behind his calm, professional facade. Soon Max stepped away to field yet another phone call, this time from his father. Sophie watched him through the glass pane of the exam room door. He paced back and forth, phone pressed tight against his ear, eyes narrowed. Though she couldn't make out the words, the sharp tone of his voice and the way he threw his free hand in the air suggested an argument. When he returned, the stress lingered around him like a cloud. A few hours after that, a tall, impeccably dressed man arrived, flashing a visitor's badge and striding through the clinic with an air of entitlement. Sophie had just woken from a brief doze beside Buddy's kennel when she saw him approach Max in a corner near the front desk. She caught the phrases, "reputation of the clinic," and "unnecessary charity cases," hissed in a low voice. Her chest tightened. She guessed it had something to do with her and Buddy. While the pair spoke, Max's posture went rigid. He stood a good head taller than the newcomer, but that didn't stop the man from delivering a stern lecture, jabbing his finger in Max's direction. At one point, the visitor glanced directly at Sophie, his expression showing thinly veiled disdain. She pressed closer to Buddy's kennel, stroking his fur as if that touch could shield them both. Eventually, Max broke off the conversation and guided the man toward a more private area. Sophie heard muffled voices, but she couldn't make out the details. Guilt and defensiveness warred within her. She hated the thought of being a burden, yet she knew Buddy's life depended on staying put. Moments later, Sophie ventured into the hallway, trying to find a water cooler, and accidentally overheard a snippet of the ongoing discussion. The visitor's voice was tight with disapproval. "You have investors to think about," he was saying. "If you alienate them by devoting resources to lost causes, you risk the entire operation. People talk, Max. This is not the kind of story we want circulating." Sophie felt her cheeks burn at the words, "lost causes." She held her breath, wanting to retreat but unable to resist listening for more. Her heart thudded painfully when Max defended her, insisting the clinic's mission was to help animals, not just pad a bottom line. The visitor scoffed, retorting that altruism was admirable up to a point, but not at the expense of everything else. When the conversation ended, the man strode away without so much as a nod in Sophie's direction, disappearing behind the heavy front doors. Max, noticing Sophie nearby, exhaled slowly. She opened her mouth to apologize for causing trouble, but he shook his head gently. "You don't have to say anything," he told her. "This is my choice." "But I feel awful," Sophie replied, words tumbling out. "I don't want to mess things up for you. Buddy's all I have." Max placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder for a brief moment. "We'll figure it out," he said quietly, though his eyes betrayed a flicker of uncertainty. Tension bristled further when a senior veterinarian, a wiry older man with a disapproving frown, stormed into the hallway demanding an explanation for using expensive medication on a dog whose owner couldn't pay. His voice carried, echoing off the pristine walls. Sophie felt smaller with each echo, her cheeks hot. She instinctively curled her arms around herself as if to shield against the harsh words. Max stepped forward, calm but firm. "Doctor, we are in the business of saving animals, not turning them away to die," he said. "You know that as well as I do." "But you can't bankrupt the clinic for a single case," the older vet snapped. "We have responsibilities, payroll, overhead costs." "And I'll handle it," Max interrupted. "Right now, our priority is keeping Buddy alive. If you disagree, you can take it up with me privately." The senior vet glared, then spun on his heel and stomped off. Sophie's eyes burned with tears she tried to hold back. She stepped away, heading for the quiet of an unoccupied waiting area, and sank onto a bench. A moment later, Brianna entered, scanning the hall until she caught sight of Sophie. She hurried over, concern lighting her face. "What happened?" Brianna asked gently, rubbing Sophie's back. Sophie heaved a shuddering sigh, battling tears. "They're all upset with Max for helping me, or I guess more specifically for helping Buddy. Apparently, it's putting him at odds with the clinic's management." Brianna exhaled. "I'm sorry. I know it's not easy, but you have to accept his help. It's the only way Buddy's going to get through this." Sophie nodded, wishing she felt more at ease. Eventually, Brianna stood to give Sophie some space, promising she'd be back later. Left alone, Sophie wandered to the small kitchenette area where she found Max sitting with 2 cups of coffee. He gestured for her to join him. She slipped into the seat across from him, and for a moment, they sipped in silence. "Everything's changing so fast," she said at last. "Last night I thought Buddy might not make it through until morning. Now he's stable, but I feel like I'm drowning in other problems." Max nodded, his own coffee seemingly forgotten. "I know. This place, my father and his associates, they see every decision as a line on a balance sheet. You and Buddy are more complicated than that." Sophie studied his face. "Why are you doing all this? For a random stranger and her dog?" He shrugged softly, a small, tired smile curving his lips. "I became a veterinarian to help animals, not to run a corporation. I couldn't just drive by and pretend I didn't see you two suffering." They exchanged small details of their lives, though it was only the briefest glimpse. He hinted at a family legacy tied to the clinic and some friction he'd had with his father for years. She mentioned her rough childhood and how Buddy was a stray she'd rescued. The conversation was calm, private, and surprisingly intimate for 2 near strangers. A beep from down the hall pulled them both back to reality. They headed to Buddy's kennel, where the technician was in the middle of checking vital signs. Buddy looked up, tail thumping weakly. Sophie's heart soared. She reached through the bars to ruffle his ears, tears welling as she realized he seemed a fraction stronger than before. Max offered her a gentle smile. "He's improving," he said softly. "It's a good sign." Sophie let out a relieved laugh, tears glistening as she laid her forehead against the kennel door. In that moment, she forgot about the tension and the finances. Buddy was alive, and that was a victory she needed. Still, the reality of the situation wasn't far behind. Later that afternoon, once all the preliminary tests and treatments were tallied, Max pulled Sophie aside in the corridor. He looked tired, as though he hadn't slept at all. She spotted a fleeting worry in his eyes before he spoke. "There's a board meeting in a couple of days," he said, his voice low. "They'll question everything I've done for Buddy. I want to warn you in case it gets messy, but that doesn't mean I'm giving up." A fresh wave of gratitude and anxiety washed over her. "Thank you for letting me know," she whispered, wishing there was some way she could relieve the weight on his shoulders. Before she could say more, a passing nurse handed Max a new set of test results. He scanned them quickly, brow furrowing deeper with every line. Sophie braced herself, heart pounding. By the time he finished reading, his shoulders looked stiff with tension. She willed herself not to panic. "Looks like Buddy's infection is more complicated than we initially thought," Max said. "He may need a specialized surgical procedure sooner rather than later. The infection might have done damage internally that medication alone won't fix." Sophie's blood ran cold. She felt as if she'd been punched. Surgery meant an even bigger bill, more intense recovery, and more complications all around. "Surgery?" she echoed, her voice quavering. Max nodded somberly. "We'll need to do it soon, or the risk of permanent damage becomes much higher." Sophie stared at him, mind swirling, unable to form a coherent response. Her throat felt tight. If saving Buddy had been expensive before, what was it now? She opened her mouth, but no words came. Max informed Sophie that Buddy might need an expensive surgical procedure. She stands speechless, fear gripping her. She needs to decide quickly. Time is running out. Sophie stood in silence as the word surgery lingered between her and Max. She looked over at Buddy, who rested inside a cushioned kennel, his breathing shallow and eyes half closed. The thought of cutting him open terrified her, but the idea of losing him entirely was even worse. She finally found her voice, though it trembled with uncertainty. "Whatever it takes," she whispered. "If this is what he needs, then we'll do it." Max gave a small, encouraging nod, but Sophie could tell he wasn't fully at ease. The surgery was expensive, and the resources at the clinic were already stretched thin. The mention of the board meeting from earlier still weighed on them both. He sighed gently and told her they'd set up additional tests to pinpoint the best strategy for Buddy's operation. As he walked away, clipboard in hand, Sophie noticed the tension in his shoulders. She wished she could reassure him, but she had no idea how. That night, the corridor lights were dimmed, lending the clinic a hushed, almost secretive air. The place felt less cold somehow, as though it were holding its breath for what would happen next. Sophie sat with Buddy, stroking the top of his head through the kennel bars, murmuring soothing words. He blinked up at her, and though he seemed exhausted, there was a faint wag of his tail that gave her hope. Brianna showed up a little later, bringing takeout coffee and a tired smile. She handed one cup to Sophie and took a seat on the bench across from Buddy's kennel. "How's he doing?" Brianna asked, keeping her voice down. "Stable, but—" Sophie paused, swallowing hard. "The vet says he'll need surgery soon. I don't know how I'm going to pull together the money. And the clinic staff. Some of them aren't thrilled that Max is helping me so much." Brianna reached out and gave Sophie's shoulder a supportive squeeze. "You know I'll do whatever I can to help you," she said, her expression resolute. "Even if that just means being here. We can't give up now." Sophie nodded, eyes watering with relief. "Thank you," she whispered. She took a shaky sip of coffee and tried to think of practical ways to raise funds. Her mind darted from idea to idea. A bake sale, a crowdfunding page, maybe selling more of her things. She had no illusions about how far those might go, but she had to try. A sharp voice from down the hallway broke their hushed conversation. Sophie recognized the older veterinarian who'd argued with Max before. He was lecturing a junior staffer about wasting resources, pointing out the newest set of expensive medications stacked in the supply area. Sophie's cheeks warmed with shame. She hated feeling like a charity case, and worse, she hated that Buddy's life was being painted as some kind of financial drain. She lifted her chin, steeling herself. She refused to feel guilty for fighting for her dog. Later, Max called a brief meeting with the clinic team responsible for Buddy's care. They gathered around a small table in the break room, a junior vet with caring eyes, two technicians who avoided Sophie's gaze, and the older veterinarian who was none too subtle about his disapproval. Max explained that Buddy needed immediate antibiotic protocols to keep the infection at bay until the surgical date. He asked for updates on blood work and scans, ensuring everyone understood Buddy's treatment plan. When the older vet pressed him about the mounting costs, Max's voice remained level. "We have a responsibility to help," he said. "That's our purpose, isn't it?" Sophie stood by the doorway, feeling simultaneously grateful and awkward. She wasn't meant to be part of the meeting, but she couldn't help overhearing. When Max finished, the team dispersed with solemn faces. The older vet stalked off, muttering something about idealism and draining resources. The junior vet offered Sophie a kind smile before returning to her duties. That tiny kindness felt like fresh air in a stuffy room. By the time the meeting ended, Buddy had been moved to a quieter area of the clinic, a small but comfortable enclosure with a soft pad beneath him and enough space for an IV stand. Sophie settled on a nearby stool, refusing to leave him alone. Whenever a staff member came to check on Buddy, she perked up, needing every bit of information she could get. Hours later, Brianna convinced Sophie to take a break. They stepped outside, letting cool night air wash over them. The sidewalk glistened under the streetlights from an earlier rain, and a mild wind rippled through the trees along the curb. Sophie inhaled deeply, trying to clear her mind. Despite her overwhelming worries, there was a tiny light of hope in the back of her thoughts. Buddy had made it this far, after all. "Maybe we could contact an animal rescue organization," Brianna suggested. "Some have funds for emergency procedures." Sophie took out her phone and began browsing. She noted down a couple of places that offered small grants or loans for life-saving surgeries. She even found a rescue foundation that had helped families in dire situations before. Though nothing was guaranteed, simply having leads lifted her spirits. They returned inside, the sterile smell of disinfectant hitting their noses. A young technician handed Sophie a printout with estimated costs for Buddy's future procedure and hospital stay. Her heart sank reading the total, but she inhaled and forced herself to remain calm. She thanked the technician quietly and placed the paper in her bag. One problem at a time, she told herself. The next day, Buddy began a new therapy regimen to manage his pain and keep the infection from spreading further. Sophie stayed by his side, stroking his ears and whispering reassuring words. Though the dog was weak, he'd occasionally lift his head, nuzzle into her palm, and let out a faint wag. Each small sign of life buoyed Sophie's resolve. At lunchtime, Max joined her in the clinic's modest waiting area. He looked drawn, with slight shadows under his eyes, but he offered a reassuring smile. "I talked to a few colleagues," he said. "One recommended a specialized antibiotic we can add to Buddy's regimen. It might give him a better fighting chance during surgery." Sophie brightened a bit. "Thank you for pushing so hard," she said softly. "I know it hasn't been easy for you." He shrugged, eyes drifting momentarily to a passing nurse. "I'm just doing what I believe is right. But the board meeting is coming up soon and they're going to want explanations. I'm prepared to face them, though." She couldn't miss the hint of anxiety in his voice. It struck her how much he was risking: his professional standing, his relationship with his father, maybe even his finances. The thought made her throat tighten with an odd blend of gratitude and guilt. That afternoon, she decided she couldn't sit idle anymore. After making sure Buddy was comfortable, she left Brianna in the clinic to keep watch and set off on foot. She visited 3 different local businesses, asking about any work they might have available. Everywhere she went, though, she was greeted with polite apologies. No openings, or they needed full-time employees, or the wage would be too low to help much. Still, she refused to be discouraged. When she thought of Buddy lying in that kennel, tail beating softly when she approached, she found more resolve than she ever knew she had. One small glimmer of hope came from a local rescue group that agreed to consider Buddy's case if Sophie submitted an application detailing his condition and the estimated costs. They said it could take time, but at least it was a start. She left their modest office with fresh determination pulsing through her veins. By the time she returned to the clinic that evening, her feet ached. She headed straight for Buddy, who lifted his head at her approach. A relieved smile broke across her face. "Hey, boy," she murmured, leaning in to touch noses with him through the kennel door. "I'm not giving up on you." Max appeared moments later, expression a mix of reassurance and fatigue. He'd apparently spent most of the day fighting for more resources and smoothing things over with skeptical staff members. But there was a small victory. The antibiotic combination seemed to be helping. Buddy's temperature was more stable, and his breathing hadn't worsened. Sophie let out a shaky laugh. "A small step in the right direction," she said. Max nodded, sinking onto a nearby chair. "Exactly. We'll keep going." Night fell again, and the clinic quieted except for the occasional hum of equipment. Sophie lingered near Buddy until her eyelids drooped. Eventually, she dozed off in a chair, arms folded on her lap. When she stirred, it was to the sound of low voices in the corridor, another tense conversation, likely about finances or the board. She tiptoed closer and overheard bits of it. A staffer warned Max about his father's growing impatience and about the possibility of major cuts. Max responded calmly but firmly that he wasn't backing down. Sophie's heart clenched. She considered confronting him, telling him she didn't want him to lose everything for her and Buddy, but something stopped her. She could sense how important this was to him on a deeply personal level. Instead, she returned to Buddy's side, waiting for Max to finish. It was close to midnight when Max finally emerged, shutting off the hallway lights behind him. He looked exhausted, his shoulders slumped, tie loosened around his neck. "Sophie," he said quietly, noticing she was still awake, "you should get some rest too." She rose from her chair, stepping close enough to see the worry in his eyes. "I can't thank you enough," she murmured. "I know how much you're fighting for Buddy. And for me." He stood there a moment, studying her, before he exhaled. I can handle it. One thing I can't handle is watching him suffer, so I'm going to do what I have to do. For a second, Sophie felt a twist of emotion so strong she couldn't speak. Gratitude, concern, admiration, all rolled into one. She gently nodded, and the corners of Max's mouth curved into a faint smile. Try to get some sleep, he repeated, more softly this time. Then he turned toward the exit, presumably to head home for what little night remained. She watched his figure recede, and her heart gave a pang. Tomorrow would bring more challenges, and she wasn't sure how they'd navigate them all. But in that fleeting moment she believed in Max's promise, and she believed in Buddy's strength to hang on until the surgical day arrived. Before he pushed open the door, Max glanced back at her. His voice carried softly through the hushed corridor. I won't let Buddy suffer. She watched him go, her heart pounding with gratitude, and a hint of fear at what might be waiting for him outside these walls. The next morning brought fresh sunlight streaming through the clinic's glass doors, painting the reception area with bright slants of gold. Sophie stood by Buddy's new enclosure, sipping lukewarm coffee and watching him doze. He looked marginally better, his breathing steadier, his fur brushed clean by a kind junior technician. Still, the looming deadline for his surgery knotted her stomach in worry. She glanced across the hall where Max was in heated conversation on his phone. Even from a distance, she could read the tension in the set of his shoulders and the way he pressed his fingers to the bridge of his nose. He'd been battling the board's demands for days now, and the strain showed in the faint shadows under his eyes. Sophie couldn't help feeling guilty that she was the source of so much trouble. A few minutes later, Max hung up and made his way over. He tried to manage a gentle smile, but concern shone behind it. "How's Buddy this morning?" he asked, kneeling by the enclosure to greet the dog with a soft scratch behind the ears. Sophie drew a slow breath. "Better, I think," she said. "He even raised his head when I came in." Max nodded, relief flickering in his eyes. "That's a good sign. We'll monitor him closely today. The infection seems more under control, but we can't relax just yet." Before Sophie could respond, the older veterinarian, Dr. Foster, rounded the corner. He carried a clipboard and wore a stern, impatient expression. He cast a glance at Sophie that bordered on disapproval. "Max," he said curtly, "we need to finalize the supply orders for next month, and you know what the board wants. Is this really the time to be—" His gaze flicked to Buddy, then back to Max. "Pouring more resources into a questionable case?" Max stood up slowly, crossing his arms. "We can talk in my office, but let's be clear. Buddy isn't questionable. He's an animal in need, and we're veterinarians. That's the end of it." Dr. Foster's mouth tightened, but he nodded. Without another word, he spun around and headed for the corridor leading to the administrative wing. Max gave Sophie an apologetic look, then followed, disappearing behind a frosted glass door. Sophie let out a tense sigh. She felt a surge of anger at Dr. Foster's choice of words. Questionable case, as though Buddy were nothing but a line item in a ledger. Determined to be useful, Sophie decided to spend the day searching again for ways to cover at least part of Buddy's care. She dug out her phone, which was already loaded with bookmarked pages for grants, charitable funds, and local rescues. Before stepping into the corridor for a quiet corner to make calls, she paused at Buddy's enclosure, stroking his ear. "Hang in there, Buddy," she whispered. "I'm not giving up." She found a spot near a wide window, the morning light warming her back as she dialed number after number. The conversations blurred into one, sympathetic voices telling her funding was limited or that applications might take weeks to process. By midday, her throat felt raw from repeating the story, and her hope had begun to fray. Just when she was about to stop, she tried one last organization. This time, the person on the other end didn't instantly shoot her down. They asked thoughtful questions: Buddy's condition, the estimated costs, how soon the surgery needed to happen. Sophie's heart thumped as she relayed every detail she could think of. The representative sounded interested but non-committal. They'd need proof, paperwork, medical reports. Still, it was better than a flat no. They scheduled a follow-up call to discuss next steps. Buoyed by that sliver of promise, Sophie returned to Buddy. In her brief absence, a junior technician had come by to change his bandage and check his IV. Buddy's tail gave a weak wag when he saw Sophie. She sank to her knees, resting her forehead against the enclosure bars. "Someone might be able to help," she murmured, voice shaking with a mix of relief and lingering fear. "It's not certain, but it's something." She felt a warm presence at her side and looked up to see Brianna, who'd arrived quietly. Her friend crouched down and gently squeezed Sophie's shoulder. "Any lead is good news," she said, her own smile tentative. "We'll keep our fingers crossed." "Yeah, it's just all so overwhelming." Sophie glanced down the corridor where Max had disappeared earlier. "And he's under so much pressure." Brianna nodded, her eyes following Sophie's. "He's risking a lot, isn't he? You can feel the tension whenever he's around certain staff." A door slammed in the distance, punctuating her words. Not long after, Dr. Foster stormed past, clipboard tucked under one arm, shooting an icy glance Sophie's way. She forced herself to keep her chin high, refusing to be cowed. Buddy's life wasn't some inconvenience, no matter how the man viewed it. Brianna stayed with Sophie for a couple of hours, offering moral support. She helped Sophie fill out preliminary forms for potential sponsorship and jotted down more ideas for short-term fundraising. Every so often, a staff member would brush by, dropping a snippet of conversation or a concerned look. Some avoided eye contact entirely. Sophie tried not to take it personally, but it wasn't easy. Around midday, Max finally emerged from his meeting, looking visibly drained. Dr. Foster was nowhere to be seen. Max made a beeline for Sophie and Brianna, glancing at the stack of papers in Sophie's hands. "What's all this?" he asked, voice hushed. "Applications," Sophie replied. "I've been contacting different groups that help with emergency vet bills. There's a chance one might come through, but I need to send them paperwork and an official estimate from the clinic." Max's eyes lit with a glimmer of hope. "I can arrange that. Let me know which documents you need and I'll have the receptionist compile them." Sophie nodded. "Thank you. Really." He offered a tired smile, then addressed Brianna. "Thank you for sticking around. This has been a trial for all of us." Brianna shrugged with a friendly grin. "I'm just doing what little I can." The phone at the reception desk rang, cutting their conversation short. The receptionist answered, glanced at Max, and waved him over with urgency. He muttered a quick apology and hurried off. Sophie watched him go, her heart tightening in sympathy. He was juggling the clinic's financial woes, staff disagreements, and his father's expectations, all while trying to save a dog whose owner he barely knew. She hoped he wouldn't regret all he'd done for them. By late afternoon, Buddy's vitals remained stable. The staff who did check on him performed their duties efficiently, though most kept interactions with Sophie to a minimum. She reminded herself that they were professionals first and foremost. They might not approve of her presence, but they cared for Buddy as best they could. Feeling restless, Sophie stepped outside for fresh air. The sky overhead was a pale blue streaked with the first hints of evening clouds. She let the breeze brush her cheeks, inhaling slowly. Her phone buzzed and her stomach clenched. Another debt collector, perhaps? Or more rejections from charities? Steeling herself, she checked the screen. The caller ID was an unfamiliar number. Heart-pounding, she answered. A polished voice introduced itself as someone affiliated with a local philanthropic sponsor who had heard about Buddy's case. They had seen a post on social media, likely something Brianna had shared, and they were intrigued by Buddy's story. The representative asked if Sophie might be open to discussing a potential sponsorship for his surgery costs. They spoke in vague but promising terms, hinting at enough money to cover the immediate procedure. Sophie's thoughts whirled. Could this be real, or was it some scam? Every nerve in her body buzzed with excitement and doubt. Still, She found her voice and agreed to set up a meeting. The sponsor's representative said they'd call back soon with more details. Sophie ended the call, her grip on the phone so tight her knuckles turned white. Her mind raced with the possibilities. If this was legitimate, Buddy's surgery expenses might be within reach. Yet there was something about the hush in the caller's voice that made her uneasy. They asked too few questions about Buddy's medical condition, focusing instead on how inspirational the story was. A tiny alarm bell rang at the back of her mind, reminding her that not all offers came from pure motives. Still, if it meant saving Buddy, how could she turn it down? She stared at the phone screen, breath shallow. Part of her wanted to run inside and immediately tell Max. Another part hesitated, unsure if she should wait until she had more information. She closed her eyes, imagining Buddy's gentle eyes and wagging tail. For him, she had to consider every possibility. Clutching the phone, Sophie made her way back inside. Buddy stirred as she approached, tail tapping lightly against the enclosure floor. She crouched to rub his ears. Even that small sign of affection melted her heart. She couldn't lose him, not after everything they'd been through together. Blinking hard, she stood and pressed the phone to her chest. One call was all it took to shift her hopes, but also to spark a new round of worries. The prospect of a sponsor seemed almost too good to be true. Yet if it meant saving Buddy from a dangerous fate, she was willing to explore every avenue. She fed the dog a few treats the staff allowed, quietly reassuring him that they were close to something better. Her voice trembled with nervous anticipation. If the sponsor was real, maybe all the uncertainty and resentment brewing in the clinic could ease. Maybe Max wouldn't have to face the board's wrath for a single case that bled resources. Maybe Sophie could regain some control over her life. Lost in these thoughts, she jumped when her phone buzzed again. A text, this time, from the same unknown number. "We'll be in touch soon. Be ready." Sophie glanced around. Max was busy down the hallway, leaning over a chart while the older veterinarian talked in heated whispers. This new sponsor situation could be a blessing or another roadblock. She honestly couldn't tell yet. But time was short, and Buddy's surgical window was looming. She swallowed hard, returning her attention to the dog who needed her more than ever. She knelt, brushing her fingers along Buddy's fur. Despite all the stress, her heart lifted at the gentle warmth of his gaze. Her phone screen dimmed, but the words lingered in her mind. They could change everything, or make it worse. With no other choice, Sophie inhaled and steeled herself for whatever might come. Sophie ends the call and stares at Buddy, mind racing. This mysterious potential sponsor could change everything, or bring more trouble. She must decide whether to trust them. Sophie woke up to the soft beeping of an IV pump and the muffled chatter of the clinic staff. She had dozed off in a chair beside Buddy's enclosure, using her jacket as a makeshift blanket. Outside, a haze of early morning light filtered through the high windows, illuminating the rows of kennels. Buddy slept peacefully for now, though occasional twitches of his paws hinted at his lingering discomfort. Sophie gently reached in to stroke his fur, hoping her presence might ease whatever dreams he was having. Her phone vibrated in her pocket, snapping her out of her own drowsy state. She half expected it to be another well-meaning but ultimately unhelpful rescue organization. Instead, the caller ID showed no name, just a string of numbers. Heart in her throat, she answered, praying it might be the sponsor who had phoned the day before. But the line crackled with silence, then clicked off. A chill snaked up her spine as she lowered the phone. Maybe it was just a wrong number, or maybe not. She slid off the chair and straightened her stiff limbs. Across the corridor, she spotted Max in his office, hunched over paperwork. His hair was slightly disheveled, as though he'd run his hands through it too many times in frustration. Sophie debated whether to tell him about the mysterious calls, but he had enough worries. Dr. Foster, the surly older vet, had already stormed past several times this morning, his expression growing darker each time he glanced in their direction. Determined to help, Sophie decided to continue her job search. She had to try making enough money to at least cover Buddy's medication, if not the entire surgery. Her thoughts still reeled from the sponsor's vague promise. Could she rely on a stranger's money, especially if it came with strings attached? With no clear answers, she scribbled down a few addresses of local businesses she hadn't yet approached and left the clinic for an hour or two, leaving Brianna to watch over Buddy. Her first stop was a small cafe on a bustling street. She stood in line, waiting for the manager. When her turn came, she handed over a simple resume detailing her prior experience at a local bakery. The manager, a kindly older woman, seemed intrigued, until Sophie mentioned she needed the position urgently. A note of sympathy crossed the manager's face, but the cafe only had room for part-time hours at minimum wage. Sophie forced a polite smile, her chest tightening as she realized it wouldn't be nearly enough. Outside, the sun was climbing in the sky, intensifying the heat that radiated off the pavement. Sophie wiped sweat from her brow and trudged to the next business, a small bookstore wedged between a pizza shop and a nail salon. Its interior smelled of old paper and leather bindings, and the soothing ambiance momentarily calmed her nerves. Yet after a brief chat with the clerk, she learned they weren't hiring. Dejected, she thanked them anyway and walked out, feeling the day's weight piling up. Her phone buzzed again, this time a text message from a number she didn't recognize. She ducked into a quieter side street, heart pounding as she read, "Hope you haven't forgotten our conversation. We're still interested in Buddy's story. Potential media angle. We'll call soon." Sophie's palms grew clammy. Was this the same sponsor? She typed a cautious reply, asking for more information, but the text icon simply spun for a moment before the entire conversation disappeared. She blinked, unsure if her phone was malfunctioning or if the sender had retracted the message somehow. Pushing aside her unease, Sophie decided to return to the clinic. She'd make more calls from there, near Buddy. The moment she stepped inside, she noticed tension crackling like electricity in the air. Dr. Foster stood at the reception desk, voice raised while Max spoke in quiet but firm tones. "You can't ignore the board's directives," Dr. Foster snapped, slamming a file onto the counter. "We're hemorrhaging funds, and you're pouring more resources into one patient who can't pay. Where does it end?" Max's voice stayed level, though a muscle twitched in his jaw. "We exist to help animals, not just profit from them. If you can't see that, maybe it's time you questioned why you're here in the first place." The older vet glowered, his gaze flicking to Sophie as though she were the embodiment of everything wrong. Sophie's stomach knotted, but she lifted her chin. She wouldn't show fear. He brushed past, nearly bumping her shoulder, and stormed down the hall. Max exhaled heavily, then turned to Sophie. "I'm sorry you had to witness that," he said, dropping his volume. "He's under a lot of pressure too, but he's handling it poorly." Sophie just nodded. "I understand." She paused, wanting to ask if everything was okay, but it felt obvious that things were far from fine. Behind them, a staff member emerged with Buddy's latest blood test results. Max quickly scanned the papers, brow creasing. "His infection is responding to the meds, which is good news, but the window for surgery is getting tighter. We can't delay much longer." The words sank in hard, reminding Sophie that time was running against them. Each hour they waited upped Buddy's risk of complications. She swallowed and tried to steady her voice. "I'll figure something out," she murmured. "I promise." As Max headed off to handle another patient, Sophie made a beeline for Buddy. He lay curled on his cushion, eyes opening when he heard her footsteps. The relief of seeing him more alert twisted her heart with both hope and dread. She reached through the kennel bars, caressing his fur, whispering about how strong he was. If only she had a fraction of that resilience for herself. In the early afternoon, she received another text from the unidentified sponsor. This time it read, "A short interview could secure Buddy's funding. Think about it. People want an emotional story they can rally behind." Sophie's stomach flip-flopped. They'd mentioned media. Did they want her to go public with Buddy's plight for the sake of donations? That might help, But it could also turn Buddy into a spectacle. The idea left a bitter taste in her mouth. Mid-thought, she felt a tap on her shoulder. Turning, she found herself face to face with a tall, stern-looking man she recognized from photos in the hallway. Max's father, Richard Carter. He wore a tailored suit that looked out of place in the clinic's scrubs and sneakers environment. His cold gaze flicked between Sophie and Buddy. "So you're the one my son's been pouring clinic resources into," Richard said flatly, cutting right to the point. Sophie bristled. "I'm just here to get my dog the care he needs," she replied, trying to keep her voice respectful. He gave a curt nod as if acknowledging her nerve. "I've heard your story. It's unfortunate, but the clinic isn't a charity. Max's heart is in the right place, but he can't put the entire operation at risk for one case." Sophie felt heat flood her face. "I'm doing everything I can to find a way to pay for Buddy's surgery. It's not like I wanted any of this." Richard's lips thinned. "No one ever wants to be in debt. But your situation is affecting more than just you. If Max continues on this path, the clinic stands to lose major backing." His voice lowered. "Don't be the reason my son's future is jeopardized." She stared, words jamming in her throat. Richard pivoted on his polished heel, striding off with an air of finality. Sophie slumped against the kennel, trembling with equal parts anger and shame. She'd never asked Max to risk everything for her. She needed Buddy to live, but not at the cost of Max's career or the clinic's survival. Brianna arrived just then, having heard murmurs of the confrontation. She hurried over, concern shadowing her features. "Hey, are you all right?" Sophie forced a shaky nod. Max's father was just making it clear that Buddy's care has consequences. Brianna offered a supportive squeeze of her hand. "Don't let him scare you off. If Max wants to help, that's his choice. We'll figure out the money, one step at a time." Sophie attempted a weak smile. She appreciated Brianna's optimism, though doubt gnawed at her. This was bigger than she'd ever imagined. The afternoon wore on. Max briefly passed by, a phone pressed to his ear, scanning the corridor for Sophie. Their gazes locked, and in his eyes, she read a silent apology for his father's behavior. She offered a small nod. Later, she caught a glimpse of him in the staff lounge, looking deflated as he slumped in a chair. She almost went in to comfort him but decided to give him space. That evening, Sophie's phone buzzed again. Another message from the sponsor. "Inspiration sells. If you're willing, we'll take care of the bills. Your dog gets his surgery, and you let people see his story. Think it over." She cringed at the transactional tone. It sounded so cold, like a business deal rather than a lifeline. But how else would she come up with thousands of dollars in time? She glanced at Buddy, breathing evenly now thanks to the medication. Her mind spun with conflicting emotions, gratitude that someone might save him, fear that she'd be trading his dignity and her own for the money. But with Max under siege from every angle and the board likely ready to cut them off, maybe she had no choice. Late that night, as the clinic settled into its usual after-hours hush, Sophie paced the hallway, reading and rereading the sponsor's texts. A swirl of anxiety tied her stomach in knots. She'd always imagined saving Buddy by her own effort, yet everything was crashing around her. Between Max's father's ultimatum and Dr. Foster's hostility, she felt cornered. Perhaps the sponsor's offer was the only realistic path. Just then, her phone chimed again. The short message on the screen sealed the urgency of the situation. "We need you on camera tomorrow." Sophie's eyes widened, torn between saving Buddy and risking a spectacle. Sophie stood in a quiet corner of the clinic's waiting area, phone clutched in her hand. The message was still glowing on the screen. "We need you on camera tomorrow." It felt like a command wrapped in an offer, and she couldn't shake the uneasy feeling churning in her stomach. She glanced at Buddy's kennel and imagined his trusting eyes, the wag of his tail whenever he recognized her scent. If going on camera could pay for his surgery, shouldn't she jump at the opportunity? but the thought of parading Buddy's suffering on a public stage made her queasy. She kept picturing microphones and prying reporters, the bright lights shining in her face, invasive questions about her finances. Still, his life was at stake. Perhaps she had no choice. Early the next morning, Sophie rode with Brianna to an address the sponsor had texted. It turned out to be a small local news station cramped into the bottom floor of an old brick building. A row of white vans sat parked along the curb, their station logos peeling in the corners. Inside, a harried receptionist ushered them down a hallway lined with framed awards. Everything smelled faintly of burnt coffee and anxiety. A producer greeted them, wearing a too-bright smile that didn't reach her eyes. She led Sophie to a cluttered office where a camera was already set up. A tall man in a headset tinkered with lighting, occasionally glancing at Sophie as if sizing her up. The producer explained that they wanted a brief segment about Buddy's situation. "Something heartwarming with a real-life heroine," she said, tapping her pen in the air. Sophie's cheeks burned at the word heroine, but she swallowed her nerves and nodded. This was for Buddy, after all. Brianna stood by, arms folded, radiating protective energy. "Just remember," she whispered to Sophie, "you don't have to answer anything that makes you uncomfortable." Sophie nodded, stepping into the small ring of lights. The camera lens felt like a dark, unblinking eye. The producer asked questions about how she found Buddy, the dog's condition, and the financial nightmare they were facing. Though Sophie's palms sweated, she forced her voice to remain steady. She told their story as truthfully as she could. She spoke of the cold night she found Buddy shivering outside her old apartment building, how their bond had grown, and how the mounting medical bills now threatened to keep him from the surgery he needed. Midway through, a different producer slipped into the room, nodding in approval as he listened. The camera operator gave Sophie the signal to wrap up. A wave of relief coursed through her. That hadn't been so bad. Maybe this coverage really would bring in donations. She looked over at Brianna, who offered a discreet thumbs up. But before Sophie could step away, the second producer piped up. "We also want some footage of the dog," he said. "At the clinic, if possible. Viewers love seeing the actual animal in distress. We'll edit it into a feature. A woman's fight to save her best friend." Sophie's stomach twisted. Was Buddy just a compelling shot to them? Still, she managed a stiff nod. This was the deal, wasn't it? After finalizing details, they left the station. Driving back, Brianna gripped the steering wheel, jaw tight. "I don't like how they talked about Buddy like he was just a prop," she muttered. Sophie swallowed. "Me neither. But if it pays off, maybe we can schedule his surgery soon. That's all that matters." When they arrived at the clinic, Sophie was greeted by the sight of Max and Dr. Foster locked in yet another tense argument near the reception desk. Foster's voice was loud enough to carry across the corridor. "Telling you for the last time, Max, the board won't stand for these reckless expenditures." Max's face was taut with anger, but his tone stayed measured. "Reckless? Saving a life is reckless? Have you forgotten what we're here to do?" Before Dr. Foster could reply, he spotted Sophie and immediately scoffed. "She's back. And who's going to pay for today's medication, Then, huffing, he turned on his heel and stalked away. Max exhaled, turning apologetic eyes on Sophie. "I'm sorry," he said. "He's letting the board's pressure get to him." Sophie offered a thin smile, choosing not to mention the nerve-wracking interview she'd just come from. "I understand," she said softly. "But how's Buddy?" "He's stable, but no major improvements. We'll need to operate soon." Max hesitated, scanning her face. "Are you okay? You look a little shaken." She nodded, not trusting her voice for a moment. Finally, she murmured, "I did an interview, hoping to get enough attention to fund Buddy's procedure. They even want to film him here." Max's eyebrows rose in surprise. "Really? That's bold. Are you comfortable with that?" Sophie was about to answer when her phone buzzed. Another message. "We're outside the clinic with a camera crew. Let us in." Her stomach sank. They were already here, faster than she'd expected. She glanced at Max, who must have seen the anxiety in her eyes. "Let's handle this carefully," he said. "Buddy doesn't need extra stress." Sure enough, 2 camera operators and a reporter showed up at the clinic's entrance. The receptionist tried to stop them, but at Max's nod, they were permitted to wheel in their equipment. Sophie guided them to Buddy's enclosure, heart hammering at the thought of bright lights glaring in her gentle dog's face. Buddy flinched when the cameras got too close, ears back in uneasy submission. Sophie crouched beside him, murmuring softly, trying to keep him calm while the reporter rattled off lines about this heartbreaking case. Something about the performance felt off. Was it really necessary to zoom in on Buddy's bandages? Did they need that many close-ups of Sophie's anxious expression? Brianna, standing a short distance away, looked like she was fighting the urge to snatch the camera away. Even Max seemed uneasy, crossing his arms and watching the crew closely. But the segment took only about 10 minutes, and when they were done, the reporter snapped her microphone off, thanking Sophie briskly before heading toward the exit. One of the camera operators gave Sophie a sympathetic shrug, as though acknowledging how intrusive this must have felt. Left in the hush of the corridor, Sophie let out a breath she didn't know she was holding. She glanced at Buddy, who settled back onto his pad, though his breathing was faster than usual. She reached through the bars to stroke his head, feeling guilt gnaw at her. She was doing this for him, right? Then why did it feel so wrong? Max edged closer, voice low. "You all right?" Sophie nodded, forcing a small smile. "I just hope this works." That evening, as the clinic staff tended to the last of their day's patients, Sophie noticed a flurry of activity near the front desk. The phone rang repeatedly. The receptionist jotted down notes, looking confused. Then, from the corner of her eye, Sophie saw Dr. Foster hurrying toward Max with a printout in hand. "We're getting calls," Dr. Foster said, voice tinged with surprise. "Donations, apparently. People saw the segment and want to help." Max's eyes widened. "That's good news, right?" Dr. Foster grimaced. "Potentially, but the board will claim you exploited the clinic's brand for publicity. They'll expect a cut of these donations. They might also use it against you if they think you're overshadowing standard operations." Max threw up his hands. "We need the money to keep Buddy alive, and to keep paying the rest of the overhead, too." Dr. Foster rolled his eyes. "You really believe the board will just let you funnel these funds into one case? This is going to stir up a hornet's nest." Before Max could reply, the receptionist called him over. More calls were coming in, some from local sponsors wanting updates on Buddy's surgery schedule. Sophie listened, heart fluttering with cautious optimism. Yet she couldn't ignore the tension in Dr. Foster's voice or the way staff cast uncertain looks at each other. This sudden wave of interest could save Buddy, but it might also push the clinic's internal conflicts to a breaking point. Late into the night, Buddy took a turn for the worse. His temperature spiked, and his whimpering grew more frequent. Alarmed staff rushed to stabilize him, adjusting his IV drip and administering additional meds. Sophie hovered anxiously, tears in her eyes as she watched the team scramble. Max led them through each step with clipped instructions, face etched in concentration. Finally, near dawn, Buddy's vitals steadied again, but the entire clinic felt rattled. The crisis was a stark reminder that time was short. First thing the next morning, they moved Buddy to an operating suite for a critical procedure to drain an abscess that flared up in the infected area. It wasn't the main surgery he still needed, but a stopgap to keep him stable. Sophie and Brianna waited in the corridor, arms linked, hearts pounding. Hours later, Max emerged from the operating room, scrubs stained and eyes rimmed with exhaustion. He nodded slowly. "He's stable. We drained the infection for now, but the major surgery is still on the horizon." Sophie choked out a quiet sob of relief, burying her face in Brianna's shoulder. Just then, a senior board member strode up, face pale with anger. "Dr. Carter," the man snapped, glancing at the half-shut doors of the operating suite. I hope you understand the consequences of your actions today. If you don't stop this, you'll lose everything. Clinic, finances, your family's trust. Max looked at Buddy's cage, then glanced at Sophie, caught in the storm with no easy way out. Max paced the corridor outside Buddy's recovery room, phone in hand, shoulders tense. Every few minutes he'd glance through the window at the dog who was resting from the emergency procedure that drained part of his infection. Sophie stood a short distance away, biting her lip as she watched Max's troubled expression. She knew he was under assault from every direction. His father, the clinic board, and now a storm of media attention from the TV feature on Buddy's fight for survival. Late morning sunlight filtered through the windows, revealing streaks of dust in the air. The clinic's usual hum felt tenser than ever, as if everyone tiptoed around the drama. A quiet beep from a machine in Buddy's room signaled his vital signs were stable for the moment, but no one could forget that the major surgery still loomed. Without it, the dog's chance of long-term recovery was slim. Max ended his call with an exasperated sigh. "They're reviewing the donations," he muttered when he noticed Sophie's concerned gaze. "The board wants to put them into a general fund, not earmarked for Buddy alone." Sophie felt her heart sink. But those donations were meant for him, right? People saw the news story. They gave money so he could have the surgery. Max pocketed his phone, his eyes flashing with anger. Exactly. But the board thinks it's a slippery slope, letting one case dictate where donations go. They want me to back off. Her stomach twisted at the unfairness of it all. The clinic had enough staff and resources to help countless animals, but Buddy's situation had become a lightning rod for internal politics. She reached out and touched Max's arm gently. "We'll figure something out." Before he could respond, Dr. Foster arrived, frowning at the thick file he carried. He seemed torn between frustration and grudging respect. "Max," he said in a low tone, "we've got another dog coming in with a severe injury. If you insist on devoting so many resources to Buddy, we might not have the capacity to handle the new case properly. We're juggling a lot." Max looked torn. "Then we'll do our best with both. That's our responsibility." Dr. Foster's jaw tightened. He hesitated as if he wanted to argue further, but Sophie guessed he was exhausted from all the conflict. With a curt nod, he turned on his heel and walked off, leaving the air around them heavier than before. Sophie let out a trembling breath. She felt more helpless than ever. Buddy was stable for now, but the antibiotics and other treatments were only buying time. Every staff member's frustration radiated in the hallways, and Max was bearing the brunt of it. Sophie hated seeing him under so much strain for a dog he'd had no obligation to help in the first place. "I might need to talk to your father," she said softly, after a moment of silence between them. Max's gaze snapped to hers, alarmed. "That's a terrible idea. He'll bully you into backing off. And if you mention the donations, he'll claim you're meddling in clinic affairs." She pressed her lips together, recalling Richard Carter's cold stare and veiled threats. "You're probably right," she admitted. "I just don't want you to lose everything for Buddy's sake." His expression softened. "I appreciate that, but I'm the one who made this choice. As long as Buddy has a shot at living, I can't turn my back. That's not who I am." A flicker of admiration passed through Sophie, along with a pang of guilt. She wished she could do more than stand on the sidelines, weighed down by financial troubles and fear. By midday, the new emergency case rolled in, a large German shepherd with a deep gash along its flank. Max and several staff rushed to stabilize the dog. Sophie watched from a corner of the hallway, noticing how each vet tech fidgeted over supply shortages, worried about whether they had enough medication. She overheard comments like, "We're overextending ourselves," and "the board's going to have a fit." All the tension threatened to crush the compassionate spirit that had once thrived here. While everyone else was busy, Sophie slipped away and took out her phone. She still had the contact info for a possible sponsor, the same group who'd orchestrated her TV spot. They had asked her to be ready for another media push if donations fell short. Part of her rebelled at the idea of turning Buddy's predicament into more publicity, but desperation gnawed at her. She typed a cautious message, asking if they could help secure funds specifically allocated for Buddy's operation, bypassing the clinic board's resistance. A moment later, the reply buzzed in, "We can talk, but we'll need more footage, something emotional. Viewers want a personal angle on your story." Her chest tightened. Did she have any choice? She thought of Buddy's warm eyes and the trust he placed in her to protect him. If going on camera again meant saving his life, how could she refuse? When Max found her in the waiting area, she told him about the new offer. His face clouded. "They want you to do another segment? Now, when everything's already chaotic?" Sophie nodded. "They're hinting at an online campaign, maybe live stream updates to show Buddy's condition in real time. Donations might pour in faster." Max's reaction was pained, like he despised the idea of turning Buddy into a spectacle. Still, desperation showed in his eyes. "The board can't claim a general fund if the donors directly label the money for Buddy's procedure. This could work, but is it what you really want?" Her throat constricted. "Not really, but what I want doesn't matter as much as saving him." Max pressed his lips together, torn. Then he gave a reluctant nod. "If you decide to do it, I'll support you. Maybe I can keep the cameras from getting in the way of his treatment." She felt a rush of relief at his understanding. Together, they walked back to Buddy's enclosure. The dog stirred, letting out a faint whine that trailed off into a soft exhalation. Sophie crouched down, running her fingertips along the edge of his fur. His breathing felt more regular, at least for the moment. That evening, as the sun dipped low, they gathered in a small meeting room to discuss how to manage the next wave of potential media coverage. Brianna joined them, perched on a folding chair with her arms crossed. Dr. Foster stood off to the side, listening with tight-lipped disapproval. Even the junior vet who'd been quietly supportive of Sophie hovered by the door, wanting to help. They all recognized that the clinic was at a tipping point. "We have to walk a fine line," the junior vet pointed out. "If we let the cameras in again, it might upset other patients' owners who want privacy. But if the money is going specifically to Buddy, it could bypass the board's attempts to generalize the funds." Brianna nodded. "Sophie, I can help arrange time so the crew doesn't wander around filming other animals. If we keep them focused, maybe we can contain the disruption." Dr. Foster looked unconvinced. "This is madness, giving a single case so much attention. We have other animals, other owners." Max faced him calmly. "And we'll care for them too. But Buddy isn't just a case. He's an animal in need, just like the shepherd we treated earlier. Once his surgery is funded, we can breathe a little easier." Sophie appreciated Max's calm defense. Dr. Foster pursed his lips but didn't argue further, and eventually everyone broke off to handle their tasks. Sophie's phone chimed again with a message from the sponsor's contact, pressing her for details. The scheduled time for filming was set for the next day, ramping up Sophie's anxiety even more. Late that night, as Sophie wandered the corridors to clear her head, she spotted Max standing alone by a window overlooking the city lights. He looked drained, a man caught between moral conviction and crushing realities. "Hey," she said softly, stepping up beside him. He turned, managing a faint smile. "Couldn't sleep?" She shook her head. "Too much on my mind." They fell into a companionable silence, the hush of the clinic wrapping around them like a blanket. Distantly, machines beeped and staff shoes squeaked on polished floors. Sophie studied Max's profile against the glow of the street lamps. He'd risked so much to save Buddy, his finances, his reputation, even his father's favor. She couldn't begin to repay that kind of devotion. "Thank you," she said at length, "for everything." He sighed, running a hand through his hair. "It's what I believe in. I just hope the board and my father see reason before it's too late." He paused, then added, "And that Buddy pulls through." A wave of emotion welled in Sophie's chest, and she placed a hand on his arm. In that moment, They shared a look that spoke volumes, shared worry, mutual support, and an unspoken bond forged in crisis. She realized how much he meant to her, and how terrifying it was that the future felt so fragile. The next morning dawned with bleary eyes and fresh tensions. Buddy's labs came back showing slight improvement, but the clock was ticking for his main surgery. Sophie, Brianna, and Max huddled over the operating schedule tacked to a whiteboard near the staff lounge, noticing an open slot. The earliest they could attempt Buddy's surgery was the next day, barely enough time to gather the funds and finalize the plan. Sophie's heart pounded. Once the date was set, there would be no turning back. Buddy either got the procedure or risked spiraling back into infection. She sensed Max beside her, reading the same lines on the schedule. Outside, staff hurried by, oblivious to the monumental choice the pair faced. Brianna checked her phone. "The sponsor's crew is coming at noon today, right?" Sophie nodded. "We have 1 day to pull everything together, or Buddy loses this slot." With determined eyes, Max reached up and circled the date with a red marker, underscoring Buddy's name. Sophie swallowed hard, feeling the tension coil in her gut. Time was running out for them both. They stood there in silence, the reality sinking in. If they couldn't secure the final funds, the board might force Max to postpone Buddy's operation indefinitely, or demand that he step down, leaving Buddy's fate uncertain. Sophie's throat constricted at the thought. So much hinged on the next 24 hours. Sophie and Max, hearts pounding, gaze at the operating room's schedule pinned on the wall. The surgery is set for the next morning. They have 1 night to make or break everything. The morning sky hung low with ominous clouds as Sophie emerged from a cramped back office at the clinic, a folder of donation pledges clutched in her hands. She felt as though she were on a tightrope, balancing hope and dread in equal measure. By evening, the fundraiser they had hastily organized would begin, and everything hinged on its success. If it went well, Buddy's surgery the next day could be fully covered. If it failed, she didn't want to think about that. She hurried to Buddy's kennel, praying he hadn't slipped again overnight. To her relief, he lifted his head at her approach, tail thumping weakly. His eyes seemed clearer, but he still breathed with a cautious rasp that hinted at how fragile he was. Gently stroking his ears, she whispered, "We're so close, boy. Hang in there." The dog blinked back at her, as if he understood every word. Down the corridor, Max was on the phone, speaking in hushed, tense tones. Sophie could tell from his stiff posture that he was talking to his father. Over the last few days, Richard Carter had made several aggressive moves, threatening to cut funding, pressing the clinic board to restrict any further charity cases, and demanding Max abandon Buddy's surgery. Yet Max's determination never wavered. Watching him now, Sophie could see the exhaustion in the faint shadows under his eyes, the cost of fighting so many battles at once. She slipped past, letting him finish the call in private, and headed toward the staff lounge where Brianna and a few volunteers were setting up boxes of pamphlets about Buddy's story. Brianna offered Sophie a reassuring grin. "You ready for tonight?" Brianna asked, tapping her clipboard. "A few local sponsors confirmed they'll come to the clinic fundraiser. We've also got a small group from that TV station. Hopefully they'll drum up last-minute donations." Sophie's stomach fluttered. "As ready as I'll ever be. Are you sure we can host it here? The clinic's cramped enough as it is." Brianna chuckled. "We'll make it work. People just want to help, or they want a story. Either way, we'll harness it for Buddy." Still, Sophie couldn't help feeling uneasy. Every corner of the clinic dripped with tension. Dr. Foster scowled at the mention of a fundraising event that might disrupt normal operations. Staff braced themselves for a chaotic evening, and no one could ignore the looming question. Would the board shut them down if they lost patience with Max's decisions? By afternoon, the clinic's waiting area was rearranged to accommodate a modest podium, a few chairs, and a table displaying photos of Buddy and his medical updates. A volunteer pinned a large donation thermometer on the wall, marking their lofty goal in bright red lines. Sophie stepped back, assessing the scene, adrenaline pulsing. It didn't look glamorous, but it felt earnest. That would have to do. Max appeared at her side, slipping his phone into his pocket. The faint tremor in his voice betrayed his stress. "My father's furious that we're doing this here," he said quietly. "He said if the turnout isn't large enough to justify the disruption, he'll personally demand my resignation at the next board meeting." Sophie's heart squeezed. "I'm sorry," she murmured. "I never wanted any of this to cost you so much." He reached out, lightly touching her shoulder in reassurance. "This isn't your fault. Remember that." As dusk approached, the clinic's overhead lights buzzed awake. People began trickling in, neighbors from Sophie's old apartment block, curious onlookers who had seen the TV segment, a handful of local donors, and even the camera crew that had briefly filmed Buddy before. They clutched brochures, milled around the small space, and eyed the donation box guarded by a volunteer. A hum of conversation rose, part curiosity, part sympathy. Brianna introduced Sophie to two individuals from the philanthropic sponsor who had reached out earlier. They wore polite smiles that didn't quite reach their eyes, but they shook hands firmly and spoke enthusiastically about the story potential for Buddy's fight. Sophie forced a thin, polite smile. She hated thinking of Buddy's ordeal as a sales pitch, but if it saved his life, she'd endure it. The event got underway with a brief introduction by Brianna, who tapped the microphone in an attempt to quiet the crowd. She shared Buddy's background, how Sophie rescued him off the streets, how he became her family, and how his recent health crisis threatened everything. Sophie stood to the side, trembling, listening to each word. Buddy's kennel remained in a back room, away from the noise, but his picture beamed from a poster behind Brianna. When Sophie's turn came, her cheeks burned as she took the microphone. She cleared her throat, scanning the faces in front of her. "Thank you all for coming," she began softly. "Buddy means the world to me. He's not just a pet, he's my best friend, and I'm here because he can't speak for himself. This clinic has done so much to keep him alive, especially Dr. Carter, Max, who refused to give up on a dog he didn't even know." She had to pause, emotion hitching in her voice. "I'm grateful for any help you can give. We're down to the wire, but we have hope." A small ripple of applause followed, though the atmosphere remained tense. Sophie thanked them and stepped away, letting other volunteers take over. She caught sight of Max near the reception desk, watching her intently. Their eyes locked in a moment that blotted out the anxious crowd, if only for a second. Then he turned to confer with a staff member, and the moment was gone. Throughout the evening, Sophie tried to greet as many people as she could, collecting small donations and listening to well-meaning suggestions. She noticed Dr. Foster hovering on the outskirts, frowning each time the cameras swung in his direction. She also spotted Richard Carter himself, Max's father, standing near a corner, arms folded. Sophie froze, uncertain whether to approach him. Eventually, he caught her eye and strode over. "This is quite the spectacle," he remarked, glancing around with an air of distaste. "If it doesn't yield enough funds for that dog's surgery, you realize the clinic will have to recoup costs somehow. My son's position is on the line." Sophie felt a spike of indignation. "I'm aware," she said curtly, wishing he'd leave. "We're doing what we can." He studied her for a moment. "The question is whether it'll be enough. Emotion doesn't pay the bills." With that, he turned and stalked away, leaving Sophie's pulse thudding in her ears. Despite Richard's cynicism, the donations steadily increased. They inched closer to the goal marked on the giant thermometer, though Sophie's heart hammered every time a new total was announced, wondering if it would be enough. Outside the clinic windows, a few onlookers peered in, snapping phone pictures. The local TV reporter lurked, occasionally interviewing attendees about why they chose to donate. Over the course of 2 hours, the clinic's cramped waiting area grew stuffy with so many bodies. But progress was tangible. The crowd murmured with excitement each time a volunteer tallied more checks and cash. Hope flickered in Sophie's chest. maybe this would be the night Buddy secured his chance. Then chaos broke out. Sophie, about to speak with another donor, heard raised voices by the entrance. A grim-faced man in a wrinkled jacket was pushing through, shouting her name. She recognized him with a jolt of fear, the debt collector who had harassed her before. He stormed toward her, demanding payment in front of everyone. "You can't run forever," he snarled, waving a paper that presumably listed her debts. "You've got money for a dog, but not for your own obligations?" The crowd drew back and cameras whirled around. Sophie's face burned as she tried to speak. I'm trying to settle everything," she stammered. "This is for Buddy's medical—" He let out a contemptuous laugh. "How convenient. So you expect everyone else to hand out sympathy and cash for your dog while you leave your own debts hanging?" Brianna jumped between them, voice firm. "That's enough. This is a private event." The confrontation threatened to derail the entire fundraiser. People shifted uneasily, some edging away. Sophie looked frantically at Max, who hurried forward, jaw tight. "Leave her alone," Max said, stepping protectively in front of Sophie. The debt collector sneered. "Figures the rich vet is defending her, but you can't hide behind him forever." With a final glare, he stomped off, leaving the room buzzing with tension. Sophie trembled, feeling tears prick her eyes. She caught the flicker of cameras, capturing every humiliating moment. Unable to stand the stairs, she slipped out a side door and into the rear lot, gulping in the cool night air. Stars glittered overhead, mocking the chaos she felt inside. A moment later, Max found her there, quietly stepping up beside her without saying a word. She sagged against the building wall, battling tears. "I'm sorry," he said gently. "He had no right to do that." She sniffed, pressing a hand over her mouth. "All these people, the cameras. I feel so exposed." He hesitated, looking like he wanted to give her space, but also desperate to offer comfort. "Even if some moments are ugly, we're close to what Buddy needs. We can't let one man's cruelty ruin that." Sophie drew a shaky breath, meeting his eyes. She saw understanding there, and something deeper she couldn't name. Before she could respond, Brianna poked her head out. "We need both of you inside. It's time to announce the final tally." Heart hammering, Sophie and Max returned to the waiting area. All eyes turned to the volunteer who held the microphone. The hush was so thick that Sophie could hear her own pulse. "The final count for tonight's fundraiser," the volunteer said, reading off a slip of paper, "is enough to cover Buddy's surgical costs and follow-up care." Applause exploded through the space, and Sophie's legs nearly buckled in relief. She brought a hand to her mouth, tears of gratitude streaking her cheeks. Max let out a breathless laugh, hugging her briefly before the cameras converged, capturing the moment of triumph. Across the room, Richard Carter stared with a stony expression, then walked away, phone in hand. Dr. Foster, for once, looked too stunned to argue. But the night wasn't over. The surgical suite awaited Buddy the next morning, and the tension lingered like a storm cloud. Everyone knew that raising the money was just one hurdle. The operation itself would be the ultimate test. If Buddy's body couldn't handle it, or if complications arose, no amount of cash could save him. At first light, staff prepped the operating room, eyes bleary from exhaustion. Sophie leaned over Buddy's kennel, heart pounding at how small he looked. Max donned his scrubs, leading a team of carefully chosen colleagues. The board might protest, but with the funds in place, they couldn't stop him now. Sophie watched through a narrow window as they took Buddy inside. The doors swung shut, leaving her in the corridor, powerless. Minutes became hours in a grueling countdown. Brianna stood with her, whispering shaky reassurances. Occasionally, volunteers popped by for updates, but the operating room remained off-limits. Sophie fought back tears, praying with every breath. Finally, the doors opened. Max stepped out, sweat clinging to his brow, surgical mask dangling at his neck. His eyes glistened with relief and exhaustion as he spotted Sophie. Max meets Sophie's eyes across the hallway, scrubs still on, voice trembling. "We did everything we could, but now it's up to Buddy." Sophie stood in the corridor, every breath tight with anticipation. Beyond the closed doors of the operating room, Buddy's life hung in the balance. Max had emerged moments ago, sweaty and exhausted, to deliver the only news he could. They'd done everything possible, and now it was up to Buddy's strength to pull through. Sophie's heart hammered as she sank onto a bench, knuckles white from clenching her hands. Brianna sat beside her, offering silent support. Neither dared speak more than a few words. The hush in that waiting area felt like a fragile bubble. If anyone so much as dropped a pen, it might shatter the thin veil of hope. Occasionally, staff moved quietly down the hall, offering sympathetic looks or a gentle squeeze to Sophie's shoulder. She appreciated their kindness but could hardly manage to speak. All she could think about was Buddy's gentle eyes, the way he wagged his tail whenever she came near, and how much she needed him to survive. Minutes blurred into hours. The day crept along as if time itself were afraid to move too fast. Between calls from worried acquaintances and texts from local sponsors checking for updates, Sophie paced, prayed, and tried not to let her fears overwhelm her. Max was still in and out of the operating room, coordinating Buddy's post-op care. Even from a distance, Sophie could see the fatigue etched into every line on his face. Late in the afternoon, the overhead lights cast long shadows across the corridor. Sophie was sitting with her head bowed when Max approached, gently clearing his throat. She glanced up, pulse leaping. "How is he?" she managed, voice tight. Max sank onto the bench, pressing a hand over his eyes. "He's alive," he murmured. "We managed to stabilize him again after a scary dip in blood pressure. It's not over yet, but he's hanging on." Relief flooded Sophie. She let out a trembling exhale as tears gathered in her eyes. "Thank you," she whispered. "I can't even begin." Max shook his head, cutting her off in the gentlest way possible. "We'll keep him in intensive monitoring. The next 24 hours are critical." He paused, searching her face. "Are you holding up okay?" She offered a small, watery smile. "As well as I can. I feel like the whole world is on pause." His gaze flicked down the hall where Dr. Foster spoke in hushed tones with another staff member. "We've got more than just Buddy's health to worry about," Max said, sighing. "My father's threatening to call an emergency board session to review my role here, as he puts it." Sophie tensed. "What about all those donations for Buddy's surgery? Aren't they enough to show that the clinic is benefiting too?" Max spread his hands, frustration evident. "He sees it differently. Says we're setting a precedent that endangers the clinic's finances. I'm not giving in, though." Then his eyes softened. "Buddy's life, and yours, are worth defending." Her heart squeezed. Before she could respond, Brianna hurried over, phone in hand. "They're moving Buddy to a post-op kennel. Doctor says we can go see him soon." Sophie stood, adrenaline spiking. "Is he awake?" Brianna nodded. "Sort of. Groggy, but stable enough that you can talk to him." Together, they made their way to a quieter section of the clinic where glass-walled kennels housed animals under close observation. Outside Buddy's new enclosure, a single IV line trailed from his foreleg. He lay on a padded mat, eyes half open, blinking slowly as if trying to grasp his surroundings. Sophie's heart melted with love and pity. She crouched down, speaking softly through the barrier. "Hey, boy," she murmured. "You're doing so well. We all believe in you." Buddy's tail gave the faintest of wags, a tiny gesture that nearly toppled Sophie into sobs. She pressed her forehead lightly against the glass, overwhelmed by gratitude. Max joined her, placing a supportive hand on her shoulder. For a moment they shared a tender silence, united by hope. Not long after, Dr. Foster approached from behind, clearing his throat. Sophie tensed, expecting yet another critique, but he merely glanced through the glass. "He pulled through a serious operation," Dr. Foster said, voice subdued. "I didn't think he'd make it, honestly. Turning to Max, he added, "We'll keep an eye on him for any signs of infection, but it looks promising." Max studied the older vet's expression, a flicker of surprise crossing his face. There was no sarcasm or anger in Dr. Foster's tone, just weary relief. Sophie wondered if, in his own gruff way, Dr. Foster cared more than he ever let on. "I appreciate your help," Max said quietly. Dr. Foster nodded and walked away without another word, leaving them to breathe in the moment of cautious victory. Hours slid by and Buddy rested, drifting in and out of light sleep. Sophie remained close, occasionally stepping out to make calls or grab water, but always returning to check on him. She knew Max was facing more chaos behind the scenes, bored phone calls, anxious staffers, but he stopped by whenever he could, offering updates or just standing by Buddy in companionable silence. By midday, Buddy lifted his head and turned it, as if searching for Sophie. She responded by sliding her fingers through the kennel bars, gently stroking his fur. His eyes reflected a flicker of recognition. The wave of emotion that seized her was so overwhelming that her knees nearly buckled. She pressed a fist to her mouth, stifling a sob of relief. Brianna arrived with a modest lunch for Sophie, urging her to eat. "You'll need strength, too," she reminded, shooting Buddy a fond smile. "Don't forget to take care of yourself." Sophie managed a nod and a few bites, though every nerve in her body remained focused on Buddy's condition. Across the corridor, Max was in deep conversation with a board member who'd shown up unannounced. She caught snippets of words: responsibility, reputation, ongoing support, all delivered in tense, hushed voices. The board member shot a glance at Sophie and Buddy, then returned to hissing warnings at Max. Once the conversation ended, the board member left, face pinched with dissatisfaction. Max headed over, pulling off his ID lanyard and stuffing it into his pocket. "They're not making this easy," he muttered, shaking his head. "But Buddy's post-op success is a great story. Some sponsors are rallying behind us, so the board is divided." Sophie exhaled. "If we can't unite them with Buddy's story, I don't know what else to do." Max gave a small shrug. "We'll figure it out, one crisis at a time." Then he gently steered Sophie toward a quiet corner. "There's something else I need to talk to you about. Something I should have told you sooner." Her heart jumped to her throat. "What is it?" He hesitated, searching her face. "I might lose my inheritance if I don't step down from managing the clinic the way my father wants. That includes letting Buddy's story fade away after this. He says I'm too invested personally, that I'm crossing boundaries." Sophie's breath caught. "He can't force you to just give up. You love this work." Max's lips compressed. "He can make it very difficult. The board is half my family's associates, half outside investors, but I'm not walking away from my principles, or from you and Buddy." His gaze went soft. "Whatever that means for me, I accept it." She felt warmth spread in her chest, along with a stab of guilt for all that he stood to lose. But there was also a fierce pride in seeing how far he'd go to protect life, human or animal, that he cared about. The next day or so blurred into a routine of vigilant monitoring. Buddy's fever subsided, his heart rate steadied, and the wound from the operation began to show signs of healing. Each small improvement felt like a miracle. Still, Sophie kept her guard up, worried that another crisis could strike at any moment. Meanwhile, the debt collector who had humiliated Sophie at the fundraiser tried texting her again, demanding immediate repayment. With the smaller donations that trickled in after the fundraiser, she managed to pay down a fraction of what she owed. It wasn't enough, but it was progress. She was determined not to let that shadow hang over Buddy's recovery. 3 days after surgery, Dr. Foster conducted a thorough exam on Buddy. Sophie and Max watched anxiously. When he finished, he looked up, sighing as though letting go of a burden. "Well," he said, carefully scratching Buddy behind the ears, "he's recovering faster than expected. If nothing changes in the next 48 hours, I think we can move him out of intensive care." Sophie nearly collapsed with relief. A huge grin stretched across Max's face. For once, Dr. Foster didn't scowl. He simply patted Buddy gently and left them with a sense that he, too, was rooting for the dog's complete recovery. Word of Buddy's improvement circulated fast. Staff members who had once eyed Sophie skeptically now offered shy smiles. A few even asked if they could take pictures for the clinic's social media, turning Buddy into a symbol of perseverance. Donations continued flowing in sporadically, some from unknown sources, allowing the clinic to offset the costs of the operation. Even the board, for the moment, seemed less hostile. On the 5th day after the operation, they brought Buddy to a quieter corner of the clinic where outside light streamed through tall windows. The dog still wore a bandage around his torso and moved gingerly, but his bright eyes and gentle tail wag spoke volumes. Sophie coaxed him forward with soft encouragement, tears welling as he managed a shaky step, then another. Max stood nearby, arms folded, an enormous smile lighting his features. "Look at him," he murmured, a mixture of awe and pride in his voice. "He's a fighter." Sophie crouched low, meeting Buddy's gaze. "You did it, Bud. You're so strong." She buried her face in his neck, inhaling the comforting scent of his fur. The sense of gratitude coursing through her was indescribable. A few days later, Buddy was well enough to attempt a short walk in the grassy area behind the clinic. Sophie and Max accompanied him, taking slow, careful steps. The early morning air smelled of dew, and birds sang overhead. Each time Buddy paused, Sophie rubbed his ears, urging him on gently. Eventually his gait steadied, and he began to trot with more confidence, tail wagging. When they reached a patch of sunlight, Buddy looked back at Sophie and Max, his eyes bright. For a moment, the two humans exchanged a glance that crackled with shared relief and the realization that everything, somehow, had worked out. Together, they had saved him. Just then, a staff member hurried outside, a phone in hand. "Max," she called, "your father's on the line. He wants to speak with you immediately." Max's demeanor shifted, tension creeping into his shoulders. "Of course he does," he muttered. Then he glanced at Sophie. "I should probably take this." She touched his arm, offering silent support. With Buddy's leash in her hand, she watched Max walk a short distance away, phone pressed to his ear. Even across the lawn, she caught snippets of the conversation. Firm words, a rising tone, and then a pause. Finally, Max hung up, slipping the device into his pocket. "That sounded intense," Sophie said softly. "What happened?" He strode back over, exhaling. "He wants to talk about the future of the clinic, about me taking a reduced role, maybe working more as a field vet and less as the chief director. He's not happy with how this all played out, but we haven't lost the clinic at least. The board's not forcing me out right now." She saw the mix of relief and sadness flicker across his face. He was giving up part of his inheritance, perhaps, but he was keeping his integrity and Buddy's life. Leaning forward, she let her forehead rest against his shoulder. They remained that way for a moment, letting the magnitude of it all settle. When they finally drew apart, Buddy came trotting over, bandage still in place but eyes shining. The tension broke as laughter bubbled from Sophie's throat. She bent to hug him again, reveling in the warmth of his fur. Max joined in, ruffling the dog's ears. It felt like a new dawn. The clinic staff who once viewed Sophie with suspicion now nodded at her in recognition. Buddy was a living testament to perseverance, and so was Max, who had risked everything to stay true to his calling. Sophie herself felt transformed by the ordeal. She was no longer the timid young woman who flinched at every setback. She'd found a well of strength she never knew existed. A week later, Buddy was deemed healthy enough to go home for continued rest and medication. Brianna helped Sophie gather supplies, while Max tidied up the discharge papers. The final bill, once terrifying, was mostly covered by donations and partial grants from the sponsorship deals that had come through after the television segment. Sophie still had debts to resolve, but she wasn't drowning anymore. She could see a path forward, one where she and Buddy stood side by side. On the clinic's front lawn, she clipped a new collar around Buddy's neck, courtesy of a small rescue foundation that had taken an interest in his story. Max lingered at her side, arms folded, a soft smile curving his lips. "Well," he said, "I guess this is farewell, for now." Sophie looked at him, feeling her heart flutter. "I'll have to bring him back for checkups," she replied, trying to keep her voice light. "You won't be able to get rid of us that easily." His eyes danced with unspoken emotion. "I'm counting on it." Brianna rolled her eyes in mock exasperation. "Oh, you two," she teased. Then she patted Buddy. "Ready to go home, big guy?" Buddy wagged his tail, stepping forward onto the grass. Sophie glanced at Max, a million words unspoken between them, but a shared warmth in their expressions that said all she needed to know. She thanked him again, voice husky with gratitude. As they crossed the lawn, Buddy bounded a few steps, obviously excited to feel the sun and grass under his paws. Sophie laughed, almost disbelieving that he'd come so far from the brink. Max watched them with a grin, hands resting at his hips. The day was bright, the air clear, a perfect stage for a new chapter to begin. As they watch Buddy bound across the lawn, Sophie and Max exchange a hopeful smile. She teases, "Let's keep helping other buddies out there," and he nods, replying, "Together, anything's possible." The promise of a new life, for them and for countless animals, shimmers on the horizon. If you enjoyed this story, don't miss the next one. Just click on the screen